I'm in my late 20s now, and every once in a while, something completely random will pull me right back to that trip. Sometimes it's the smell of wet wood after rain, or those quiet vacation ads with cabins by lakes that show up online. My parents still love those kinds of trips, but I stopped going with them years ago. Not because I hate nature or anything. Honestly, growing up, those vacations were some of my favorite memories. But that one trip changed the way I look at places that are supposed to feel peaceful. My dad was never the type who liked crowded beaches or expensive resorts. He always said vacations were supposed to feel quiet, real. He liked places where you could disappear for a few days, cook your own meals, sit outside at night, and hear absolutely nothing except insects and wind through the trees. So during school breaks, we'd usually rent small cabins in remote areas. Most of them were found through old rental websites with blurry photos and vague descriptions. They were always somewhere near forests, rivers, or lakes. Places that looked relaxing during the day, but felt completely different after dark. That year, my parents rented a cabin near a place called Blackwater Ridge, a forested area several hours from our town. I remember the drive felt endless. My mom kept asking my dad if he was sure we hadn't missed a turn, because the roads kept getting narrower and quieter the farther we went. At some point, cell service disappeared completely. And even as a kid, I remember noticing how isolated everything suddenly felt. It wasn't scary then. Though half of them flickered constantly, like they were struggling to stay on. During the day, the trail looked harmless. But at night, the woods pressed in around it so tightly that the light barely reached beyond the edges of the path. The first few days were normal. Good, even. My dad rented a canoe and spent hours trying to teach me how to paddle correctly while I mostly spun us in circles. My mom walked around the lake every morning holding coffee in both hands because the air was cold enough to make steam rise from the cup. We grilled burgers one night, chicken the next. People would stop and chat casually about where they were from or how long they were staying. There was one family with 2 little kids constantly feeding ducks near the dock. Another older couple stayed in a cabin across the lake and always sat outside after dark without speaking much to anyone. I remember seeing them watching the water at night sometimes, almost like they were listening for something. At the time, none of it felt unusual. But when I think back on it now, I remember this tension underneath everything. Something subtle. The kind of feeling you don't notice until later, when your brain starts replaying details differently. Like how nobody stayed outside very late unless they were in the main gathering area, or how quickly the trails emptied once it got dark, or how every cabin kept their porch lights on all night. The night everything happened started out completely ordinary. My parents and I were at the cooking area later than usual, finishing dinner while a few other families sat nearby talking. Someone was grilling sausages, and the smell of smoke hung in the cold air. I remember hearing laughter echo across. I probably would have laughed, because the path to the cabin looked completely normal when I started walking. That's what still bothers me the most. It wasn't like I was walking into some abandoned stretch of wilderness. I could still hear people behind me as I headed down the trail. Laughter drifted through the trees from the cooking area, mixed with the metallic clinking of dishes being cleaned near the grills. Every now and then, I'd hear someone calling to their kids, or the scrape of a chair against the wooden floor of the pavilion. That's part of why the whole thing confused me so much afterward. The trail itself felt safe. It was just a narrow dirt path cutting through the trees, lined with small lantern posts every 20 feet or so. The lights weren't bright enough to fully illuminate the woods, but they gave off enough of a glow that you could easily see where you were walking. On both sides of the trail, the forest stretched out in thick walls of pine and dark brush. Not the kind of woods that instantly scare you, just normal forest. Calm, quiet, at least at first. I remember thinking about completely ordinary things while I walked. I was trying to remember whether I'd left my phone charger plugged in near the bunk beds, and I was already picturing myself putting on the hoodie and going back to sit near the fire with my parents. Nothing felt wrong yet. About halfway down the trail, though, I heard movement somewhere off to my left. I slowed down automatically. At first, I assumed it was an animal. There were squirrels everywhere during the day, and the owners of the property had mentioned raccoons occasionally wandering near the cabins at night looking for food. But this sounded heavier somehow, more deliberate, not crashing through the woods exactly, just the subtle sound of something shifting position. I stopped walking and looked toward the trees. The light from the trail only reached a few feet into the forest before everything dissolved into shadow. I could make out trunks, low branches, patches of brush, but nothing beyond that. The darkness between the trees felt oddly solid, almost like it was hiding depth you couldn't properly judge. Then I heard a voice. "Hey." It was quiet but clear, not distant. Close enough that it immediately made my stomach tighten. At first, I honestly thought it was probably another guest from one of the cabins. Maybe someone stepped off the trail to smoke or use the bathroom or something. That would have made sense. Except, couldn't actually see anyone. I remember squinting into the darkness, waiting for somebody to step forward into the light. Nobody did. I awkwardly called back, "Hello?" Even now, years later, I can still remember how strange the silence felt afterward. Not empty silence, waiting silence. A few seconds passed, and then I heard movement again. Slow, careful, like someone adjusting their footing behind the trees. That's when the feeling changed. It wasn't fear yet, not fully. More like my brain suddenly realized something about the situation wasn't behaving the way normal human interactions do. If somebody was trying to talk to me, why stay hidden? Why not just step onto the trail where I could actually see them? Instead, whoever it was remained perfectly inside the darkness, just beyond the reach of the lights. I think that detail is what unsettled me most. It felt intentional. The voice spoke again, though I honestly can't remember the exact words now. Something short, casual, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. If the person had sounded angry or threatening, maybe I could have processed it logically. But the calmness of it made my imagination start filling in blanks. And I suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that the person knew I was alone on the trail. Not guessed. Knew. I can't explain why I felt that so strongly. But the certainty hit me instantly. Like some instinct buried under conscious thought finally woke up. I remember this cold wave running through my chest as I realized I still couldn't see a face. Not even a silhouette. Just darkness between trees and a voice coming from inside it. At that point, every part of me wanted to get out of there. I muttered something, I don't even remember what, and turned around. At first, I walked quickly because I didn't want to seem dramatic. I think part of me was still embarrassed, still trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Then I heard another movement behind me, and that tiny bit of self-control disappeared completely. I started running, not casually jogging, full panic running, shoes slamming against the dirt path while the lights flashed past beside me. I didn't look back once. I was terrified that if I turned around, I'd finally see someone stepping out from the trees behind me. Or worse, that I wouldn't. By the time I reached the cooking area, I was breathing so hard I could barely talk. My parents immediately stood up because apparently I looked genuinely terrified. I remember my mom grabbing my arm and asking what happened while everyone nearby went quiet for a second. I told them somebody had been standing in the woods beside the trail talking to me. Even while explaining it, I remember doubting myself a little. The story sounded strange the moment I said it out loud. Part of me worried everyone would think I was just scaring myself over some random person walking through the trees. But another part of me, the stronger part, knew something about that interaction had been deeply wrong. My dad grabbed a flashlight almost immediately and walked back down the trail to check. I wanted him to stay, but at the same time, I remember feeling relieved someone else was going there instead of me. My mom stayed with me near the picnic tables while I watched the dark trail leading back toward the cabins. I kept expecting to see someone emerge from it at any second, but nobody did. When my dad finally came back, he looked confused more than anything else. He said he walked the entire trail, checked around our cabin, even shined the flashlight deep into the trees. Nothing. No person. No movement. No sign anyone had been there at all. A few of the other adults nearby overheard the conversation and joined in, saying they hadn't seen anyone walking around that area recently either. One guy even joked that maybe I'd scared myself listening to animals in the woods. Everybody eventually settled on the same explanation. It was probably another guest who stepped off the trail for a minute and left before my dad got there. And logically, that explanation should have made me feel better. Instead, it somehow made the whole thing worse. Because if it really was another guest, why hide in the trees the entire time? I tried really hard to accept that explanation because it made everything feel less disturbing. If it was just another guest wandering around the woods at night, then the situation became awkward instead of terrifying. That was easier to live with. But the way that person stayed hidden behind the trees kept replaying in my head. Even the next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My parents planned to head back to the cooking area early to make breakfast. Our cabin had a tiny kitchen, but my dad always preferred cooking outside whenever he could. He said food tasted better in the cabin itself was simple. One bedroom for my parents, a pull-out couch where I slept, a cramped kitchen area, and a back door leading to a small deck facing deeper into the woods. I remember noticing how quiet everything felt once my parents were gone. Not eerie quiet. Vacation quiet. The kind where you hear wind moving through trees, distant voices from other cabins, birds chirping somewhere overhead. Peaceful enough that I slowly started calming down. And that's what makes what happened next feel so unreal when I replay it now. Because there wasn't this dramatic warning beforehand. No loud noise, no creaking footsteps outside. Nothing that gave me time to prepare. At some point, while I was half paying attention to my phone, I heard the back door open. At first, I assumed my parents had come back for something they forgot. But almost immediately, something felt off. My mom or dad always called out when they entered the cabin. Even just my name or a casual hey, that was normal. This time, there was only silence. Then footsteps, fast footsteps, not cautious either, direct. Before I could even fully turn around, something heavy dropped over my head. Everything went black instantly. For a second, my brain genuinely couldn't process what was happening. It felt confusing more than frightening at first, almost unreal, like some stupid prank that hadn't registered properly yet. Then I felt someone grab me. Hard. The panic hit all at once after that. I started screaming immediately, completely on instinct. I remember thrashing so violently that my shoulders slammed into realizing how easy it would have been for someone to overpower me completely if I stopped fighting for. The second those voices carried through the trees, everything changed. Whoever was holding me suddenly let go. I hit the ground hard enough to knock the air out of my lungs, and the cloth slipped off my head at almost the exact same moment. For a few seconds, I just lay there disoriented, staring upward while sunlight flickered through branches overhead. I remember how strange it felt that the forest still looked normal. Birds were still chirping. Wind still moved through the trees. Meanwhile, I was lying on the ground, realizing someone had just tried to take me somewhere. When I finally looked up, I caught one brief glimpse of the person running deeper into the woods behind the cabin. Only their back, dark clothing, average build, nothing distinct enough to identify. And honestly, that somehow made it scarier. There was nothing memorable about them, nothing human enough for my brain to hold on to. Just this faceless figure disappearing between trees, almost unnaturally fast. Then they were gone. My parents came running from the direction of the cooking area, along with several other people from nearby cabins who had heard the screaming. I remember my mom dropping to her knees beside me, asking over and over if I was hurt, while my dad immediately started looking toward the woods, like he wanted to chase after the person himself. Within minutes, people were everywhere. The property owners showed up. Someone called the police. Guests stood around whispering nervously, while officers searched the surrounding area and checked nearby cabins. But there wasn't much I could tell them. I never saw the person's face. The cloth over my head blocked almost everything. The police eventually said it was possible somebody from outside the property had wandered in through the forest. The cabins weren't fenced off, and the woods stretched for miles in every direction. Technically, anyone could have entered unnoticed. But that explanation never fully sat right with me, because I kept thinking about the voice from the night before. The person standing hidden behind the trees. The way they tried talking to me without stepping into the light. And the overwhelming feeling I had that they already knew I was alone. I can't prove it was the same person. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe my brain connected those events afterward because it needed the story to make sense. But deep down, I've never believed they were separate incidents. Especially because whoever grabbed me entered through the back door of our cabin, like they already understood the layout of the property. Like they'd been watching. That's the part that still bothers me most all these years later. Not just that someone attacked me, but that it feels very possible they chose me the night before. And if people at the cooking area hadn't heard me screaming when they did, I honestly don't know what would have happened after they got me deeper into those woods. until suddenly midnight feels normal. I was living alone in an older apartment building at the time. Not huge, just 3 floors and maybe 12 units total. Small enough that you recognize most of the tenants by sight, even if you never actually spoke to them. You'd pass people carrying groceries or hear them walking the halls at night, often enough that unfamiliar faces stood out eventually. The building itself always felt slightly worn down in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived somewhere like that. The carpets in the hallway never fully lost that stale smell. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The front entrance sat on the side of the building facing a narrow parking lot squeezed between 2 other apartment complexes. There was a single porch-style light above the entrance that stayed on all night, casting this dim yellow glow over the concrete walkway. The front door technically locked, but people were constantly coming and going. So half the time, someone failed to pull it fully shut, and it would sit slightly cracked open for hours. Back then, I barely paid attention to stuff like that. My routine was always the same. I'd get off work around 10:30 or 11, drive 20 minutes home, usually stop somewhere for food because I was too tired to cook. Then drag myself upstairs and collapse into bed after zoning out on my phone or TV for a while. Most nights, I didn't even really look around the parking lot when I got home. That night, though, I remember it clearly. I pulled into the lot and noticed a few cars already there. Normal ones I recognized. The pickup truck belonging to the guy downstairs who worked construction. The older sedan from the couple living across the hall upstairs. Everything looked ordinary. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed a man standing beside the front door smoking a cigarette. At first, nothing about it seemed strange. People in the building smoked outside all the time because management constantly complained about the smell indoors. He looked maybe mid-30s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. I remember the cigarette smoke drifting across the comfort shows up before your logic catches up to it. At the time, I assumed he was probably trying to find someone's apartment and didn't know where they lived. Still, the wording felt oddly direct. Not, "Do you know where apartment 3B is?" Not, "Does Jason live upstairs?" Just, "Which floor do you live on?" I remember hesitating briefly before answering vaguely. "Upstairs," I said. I didn't stop walking. I opened the front door and headed inside, while he stayed near the entrance smoking. I think he said something behind me, maybe "all right" or "gotcha." But I didn't fully turn around to continue the conversation. Honestly, the interaction barely stayed in my mind longer than a few seconds afterward. That's what bothers me now. At the time, it felt harmless because apartment buildings naturally involve small interactions with strangers constantly. People ask questions. They smoke outside. They linger near entrances. Nothing about it seemed threatening enough to hold on to. But looking back, the thing I remember most clearly is his tone. It wasn't conversational. It sounded specific, like he wanted information, not conversation. Still, I went upstairs, unlocked my apartment, and spent the rest of the night doing completely normal things. Ate food while half watching television, scrolled through my phone too long, eventually fell asleep sometime after midnight. The next day was uneventful. Work was busy enough that I barely thought about the guy outside the building at all. By the end of my shift, I remember feeling especially exhausted because I'd stayed up too late the night before. And honestly, if someone had asked me that afternoon whether anything strange was happening in my life, I would have said no without hesitation. Because at that point, the man outside my apartment still felt like one of those tiny, forgettable interactions you have with strangers all the time. I had no idea he'd already been paying attention to me. When I got home the next evening, everything looked normal again. The parking lot had the same familiar cars scattered around it, and the building itself was quiet, except for a television playing somewhere behind one of the downstairs walls. I didn't see anyone standing outside near the entrance this time, and honestly, I barely thought about the guy from the night before at all. That interaction had already started fading into the background of my memory. My apartment sat on the second floor near the back corner of the building. One of the windows faced a narrow alley-like space between properties. It wasn't an area people normally walked through. Mostly just dumpsters, patchy grass, and the back side of another building separated by a fence. At night, it stayed especially dark back there. Not pitch black, but dim enough that shapes blended together unless something moved. My routine that evening was completely ordinary. Shower after work, microwave dinner, sit at my desk for a while, scrolling through my phone before bed. The desk was positioned right beside the window because the apartment was small, and there honestly weren't many layout options. I usually kept the blinds halfway open, partly because I liked a little outside light coming into the room, and partly because completely closed blinds always made the apartment feel claustrophobic to me. That habit suddenly became very hard to justify afterward. I think it was sometime close to midnight when movement outside caught my attention. At first, it barely registered consciously. Just this subtle shift near the edge of the window that made me glance up from my phone automatically. There was a shape outside, very close to the glass. The angle looked strange at first because my apartment sat slightly above ground level but not high enough to prevent someone from reaching the window easily if they stood against the wall. I remember squinting for a second, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Then my stomach dropped. It was the same man from outside the building the night before. He was pressed right up against the window. One of his hands rested on the frame while the other worked near the bottom edge like he was trying to force the window upward. That's when I suddenly remembered I'd cracked the window open earlier for airflow. Only a little, but enough. Even now, thinking about that realization still makes me feel sick because I remember the exact moment. My brain shifted from confusion into genuine fear. Before that second, part of me was still trying to invent harmless explanations. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he had the wrong apartment somehow. Maybe. Then I realized he was actively trying to open my window, and all those excuses disappeared instantly. I froze completely. Not because I wanted to. My body literally stopped responding for a second while my brain struggled to catch up with what I was seeing. The worst part was how focused he looked. He wasn't casually peeking inside or joking around. His hands were working deliberately at the frame like he'd already decided he was getting into that apartment. Then I yelled. The sound came out almost automatically. The man jerked his head upward immediately, and for the first time, our eyes met clearly through the glass. His expression looked completely different from the calm, casual version of himself outside the entrance the previous night. There was something furious in his face. Not wild, frantic, cold, intent. That was the moment the situation became terrifyingly real to me, because suddenly I understood this wasn't random curiosity anymore. He knew exactly which apartment was mine. He'd remembered where I lived after asking me that question downstairs, and now he was trying to get inside. Before I could even stand up fully, the window suddenly lifted several more inches. One of his arms shoved through the opening. My chair tipped backward violently when I jumped up too fast. I still remember the sound it made crashing against the floor, because it mixed with my own yelling and created this horrible burst of noise inside the apartment. His hand reached toward me blindly through the gap, and it caught my hair. Only a small section near the back of my head, but the grip was strong enough to yank me backward hard for a split second. I remember the sharp sting on my scalp and the horrifying realization that he had actually touched me. That detail stayed with me for a long time afterward. The fact that the barrier between someone outside and someone physically grabbing me disappeared that quickly. I jerked forward hard enough to break free. And that's when pure panic finally took over completely. I didn't try to close the window, didn't grab anything, didn't think logically at all. Every survival instinct in my body just screamed one thing: get out! I grabbed my keys off the kitchen counter without even consciously deciding to, ran to the front door, and bolted barefoot into the hallway. I remember the floor feeling freezing cold under my feet while I pounded desperately on the apartment across from mine. I barely even knew the couple living there. We'd exchanged maybe a few hallway conversations total, but I knew they were usually home around that time, and in that moment, they felt like the only safety nearby. The guy opened the door after a few seconds, looking confused and half awake. Then he saw my face, and I remember his expression changing immediately, because apparently I looked absolutely terrified. He stepped into the hallway, asking what happened while I tried to explain between panicked breaths that someone was trying to get into my apartment through the window. Even saying the words out loud felt unreal. Another tenant from downstairs came up after hearing the noise and yelling in the hallway. Within seconds, the quiet building suddenly felt chaotic. Doors opening, footsteps, confused voices asking questions. And the entire time, all I could think was, what if I hadn't looked up at the window when I did? Within a couple of minutes, there were 3 different neighbors standing in the hallway with me while I tried to explain what had happened. I could barely get the words out properly because my whole body was shaking so hard. It felt like my brain was still catching up to reality. One second I'd been sitting at my desk, half asleep, scrolling through my phone, and the next someone was reaching through my window, trying to grab me. The couple across the hall brought me inside their apartment while the others went downstairs to check around the building. I remember sitting on their couch with his girlfriend handing me water while I kept glancing toward the apartment door every few seconds. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Even after I was technically safe inside someone else's apartment, my body still felt convinced he was nearby. That's the thing people don't really explain about fear afterward. It doesn't disappear once the danger stops. Your brain keeps waiting for it to come back. A few minutes later, the neighbors returned, saying they couldn't see anyone outside anymore. That somehow made me feel worse, because now it meant he could have been anywhere. At that point, somebody called the police, and while we waited, the entire building slowly started waking up around us. Doors opened one by one along the hallway. People stepped outside asking confused questions, trying to figure out why there was yelling in the middle of the night. The atmosphere of the building changed completely. Just 30 minutes earlier, it had been the usual quiet apartment silence. Televisions behind walls, people asleep. The faint hum of hallway lights. Now everyone sounded tense, alert. Like the building itself suddenly understood something dangerous had entered it. When the police arrived, they searched around the property first. I remember standing near the doorway of the neighbor's apartment, listening to radios crackling in the hallway, while officers checked outside near the dumpsters and alley area. Then eventually, one of them shouted something from downstairs. A few minutes later, they found him. He had been hiding inside the building the entire time. Apparently, after running from my window, he slipped through the partially open front entrance and hid near the back stairwell area. That detail terrified me afterward because it meant while I was upstairs pounding on doors in panic, he was still somewhere inside the same building listening to everything happening. When they brought him out, I saw him again briefly from the hallway. And honestly, that was one of the strangest parts of the entire experience, because he looked so ordinary. The same guy casually smoking outside the entrance the night before. The same calm voice asking me which floor I lived on, like it was harmless conversation. But now, every part of that interaction looked different in hindsight. The question no longer sounded casual. It sounded calculated, like he'd been gathering information. One of the officers later explained that he actually lived only a few houses down the street from the apartment complex. Apparently, several people in the area already knew who he was because he'd been arrested before for various incidents involving women nearby. Hearing that made my stomach turn, because suddenly the situation felt less random than I'd been trying to convince myself it was. The police asked me questions for a long time that night, while neighbors gave statements about hearing the yelling and helping me afterward. Eventually, things quieted down again. People slowly returned to their apartments, hallway lights dimmed back into silence, and the building started feeling normal again on the surface. But it didn't feel normal to me anymore, not even close. I remember going back into my apartment later and staring at the partially forced open window from across the room. The chair was still tipped over beside the desk. A few strands of my hair were caught near the frame where he'd grabbed me. That image stayed with me longer than almost anything else, because it made the whole thing impossible to dismiss as almost happening. It did happen. And the more I replayed the previous night in my head, the more disturbing it became. The first thing he ever asked me was which floor I lived on. At the time, it sounded like meaningless small talk from a stranger outside an apartment building. Now it feels painfully obvious what he was actually doing. He wasn't trying to start a conversation. He was figuring out where to find me. I grew up in a rural part of western Pennsylvania, though honestly, calling it rural doesn't fully explain the kind of place it was. Sometimes people hear that word and picture quiet suburbs with a few trees and bigger backyards. This was different. Long gravel roads with no streetlights, rusted mailboxes sitting hundreds of feet from the actual houses, old barns collapsing slowly into fields while everyone pretended not to notice. At night, the roads got so dark that your headlights felt swallowed by the woods around you. My parents moved there when I was around 12 because my dad got a job outside the county. The house itself was small and plain, just a one-story place with a basement and a backyard that faded directly into the tree line behind it. But my parents loved it immediately. My mom always talked about how peaceful it felt compared to the crowded town where she grew up. And during the day, it really did feel peaceful. I spent most of my teenage years outside because there honestly wasn't much else to do. I'd ride my bike down dirt roads for hours, wander through the woods behind our house, or help my dad with random projects around the property. Sometimes I'd disappear into the trees all afternoon without anyone worrying much, because that's just how kids grew up there. Everyone was used to distance, used to silence. Behind our house, there was an old trail cutting through the woods that eventually led to a creek maybe half a mile away. It wasn't an official path or anything, just one of those worn dirt trails locals naturally kept using over the years. People walked their dogs there, kids rode four-wheelers through parts of it, and some neighbors used it as a shortcut between properties without needing to drive onto the main road. Near the entrance of that trail sat a house people in the area quietly avoided, not in an obvious way. Nobody ever directly warned me about them growing up. There were no dramatic stories or rumors whispered around town. Looking back now, the weirdness was more in what people didn't say. The house itself stood out immediately compared to the others nearby. Most homes in that area were older farmhouses or modest ranch-style places with maintained yards and front porches people actually sat on. That property always looked neglected in a way that felt intentional. The grass was constantly overgrown. Random junk sat scattered around the yard for months at a time. Broken lawn chairs, rusted tires, old appliances. The curtains in every window always stayed closed, even during bright afternoons. As a kid, I remember thinking the place looked less lived in and more sealed off. Like the people inside didn't want the outside world looking back at them. A family lived there. A husband, wife, and their son. I honestly can't remember their last name anymore. Which might be a good thing. After everything that happened later, I'm glad certain details faded with time. My parents knew them better than I did, simply because adults in rural areas naturally crossed paths more often. My mom would occasionally mention running into them at the feed store or local grocery place. From what I understood, the parents weren't openly rude or dangerous, just extremely private, defensive almost, whenever conversations lasted too long. The son was different. He was older than me by several years, maybe mid-20s when I was still in high school, and he still lived with his parents. Around there, that alone wasn't unusual. Plenty of people stayed with family longer because jobs were scarce and properties were spread out. But there was something about him that made people visibly uncomfortable, in a way I noticed even as a teenager. It's hard to explain exactly what it was. He barely spoke most of the time. And when he did, it was usually short answers mumbled under his breath like talking itself annoyed him. But the main thing people remembered about him was the staring. If you passed him on the road or saw him standing near the edge of his yard, he'd look at you just a little too long. Not blankly, either. Intently, like he was studying you. I remember one time riding my bike past their property and seeing him standing near the mailbox at the end of the driveway. He didn't wait, didn't nod, just watched me the entire time I passed. Even after I got farther down the road, I glanced back once and realized he was still standing there, staring after me. At the time, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Because that's what people in small towns tend to do with uncomfortable situations. They normalize them. They tell themselves someone's just odd or socially awkward, because acknowledging genuine fear feels dramatic when you live miles away from everybody else. But even back then, something about him unsettled me in a way I couldn't properly explain. Not because he acted openly threatening, because he acted like someone constantly observing things other people didn't notice. And eventually, I started realizing he noticed me more than everyone else. It It was this blank kind of stare that never felt normal to me. Not angry, not friendly either. Just fixed. Like whenever he looked at someone, he was paying attention to them in a way that felt too intense for such ordinary situations. Most people glance at you and move on. He didn't. He looked at people like he was waiting for something. My parents mostly told me to keep my distance from him, which honestly wasn't difficult because we rarely interacted with that family anyway. Life out there naturally kept people separated most of the time. By the time I reached my early 20s, I was still living at home while taking classes at a community college about 40 minutes away. I also worked weekends at a small store in the next town over. My life was pretty repetitive back then. Classes, work shifts, quiet evenings at home. Nothing dramatic. And I still walked that trail behind our house all the time. Looking back now, that's the part that feels strange to explain to people who didn't grow up somewhere rural. Walking alone through the woods for an hour wasn't considered unusual. It was just normal life. I'd throw on headphones, head down the dirt trail, and usually end up sitting near the creek for a while before turning around and walking back home. The trail passed fairly close to that family's property near the entrance. But after that, it curved deeper into the woods until the houses disappeared completely behind the trees. I never thought of it as dangerous. Familiar places stopped feeling threatening after enough years. The first genuinely uncomfortable interaction happened one evening during the summer. It had been brutally hot all day. The kind of heat that makes the air feel heavy even in the shade. I waited until evening to go walking when the temperature finally started cooling down. The sun was low enough that golden light filtered through the trees in long streaks across the trail. Honestly, it should have been peaceful. I remember stepping onto the path with my headphones already in when I saw him standing near the edge of the woods. At first, I didn't think much of it. He wasn't directly blocking the trail or doing anything obviously strange. He stood a few feet off to the side, near where the path passed the corner of his family's property. I assumed he was outside doing something around the yard because people in that area were always outside working on things. But as I got closer, he started slowly walking toward the trail. I pulled one earbud out automatically, expecting maybe a normal conversation. Around there, neighbors stopped to talk all the time if they recognized you. But something about the way he approached me already felt off. Too quiet. Too focused. When I got within a few feet of him, he reached his hand toward mine. Not like a handshake. That's the part I still remember clearly because it felt so unnatural in the moment. His hand wasn't extended the way people normally greet each other. It was lower, slower, almost like he was trying to take my hand rather than shake it. I instinctively pulled mine back immediately. At first, my brain didn't even fully process what had happened. I remember awkwardly mumbling something like, "Sorry, I've got to keep going," while continuing down the trail because part of me still wanted to avoid making the situation feel dramatic. But then he stepped closer. Not aggressively, just close enough that it made my chest tighten. He started matching my pace beside me for a second. And there was this weird, awkward moment where his arm brushed against mine. I remember getting the distinct feeling that he was trying to grab my hand again. That's when the fear really kicked in, not panic exactly. More this deep instinctive discomfort that told me the interaction wasn't socially normal anymore. The entire thing probably lasted less than 10 seconds. But when I replay it now, it feels stretched out much longer in my memory. I remember becoming hyper-aware of everything all at once. The sound of gravel under our shoes, the heat still trapped in the air from the day. how quiet the woods suddenly felt without my music playing. I sped up without directly acknowledging him. And for some reason, I was afraid to look fully at his face. I don't know why that detail sticks with me, but it does. It felt like if I made direct eye contact, the situation would somehow become more real. After a few seconds, I realized I couldn't hear footsteps behind me anymore. Still, I kept walking fast until I reached the creek. Normally, I would have stayed there a while, but that evening, I couldn't relax. I kept replaying the interaction in my head, trying to decide if I'd overreacted. Part of me genuinely wondered if maybe he was just socially awkward. Maybe he hadn't meant anything by it. Maybe I'd misread the entire thing because I already found him unsettling. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about how deliberate the movement felt when he reached for my hand. Not accidental, intentional. I ended up turning around and heading home much earlier than usual. When I got back, both my parents were in the kitchen. My mom was cooking dinner while my dad sat at the table reading the local paper the way he always did in the evenings. The normalcy of it made me hesitate for a second before bringing it up, because suddenly the story sounded weird out loud. Still, I told them what happened. At first, my dad reacted the way I think most people would. He tried to make the situation smaller. He said maybe the guy was just awkward socially or trying to greet me in a strange way. But my mom looked more uncomfortable immediately. She stopped what she was doing and asked me to explain exactly what happened again. So I did. I told her he tried to take my hand, followed beside me briefly on the trail, and wouldn't stop staring at me the entire time. The more I explained it, the more unsettled I started feeling all over again, because hearing the details out loud made the interaction sound even stranger than it had in my head. My dad eventually sighed and said he'd walk over to their house the next day to talk to the parents. That was pretty normal where we lived. People in rural communities tended to handle uncomfortable situations directly before involving police or authorities. Most problems were settled with conversations across porches or driveways. At the time, I remember feeling relieved. Like maybe once my dad talked to them, the whole thing would become awkward but harmless. But deep down, I also remember this growing feeling that the interaction hadn't been random at all. The way he'd been standing there near the trail almost felt like he'd been waiting for me specifically. I wasn't there for the conversation my dad had with them the next day, but when he came home, I could tell immediately it hadn't gone well. My dad wasn't an aggressive person. Even when he was angry, he usually stayed calm in that quiet, controlled way that somehow felt more serious than yelling. But that evening, he walked into the kitchen looking genuinely irritated. According to him, the parents dismissed the entire thing almost immediately. They said I probably misunderstood what happened. Then somehow, the conversation shifted into implying that maybe I had encouraged the interaction without realizing it. That part made my stomach drop when my dad repeated it back to us. Not only because it was insulting, but because it suddenly made the situation feel uglier than awkward. My dad told them very clearly that I had done nothing to invite that behavior and that their son needed to stay away from me moving forward. From what I could tell, the conversation ended badly. And after that, something in the atmosphere around that house changed for me. Before, the discomfort had mostly felt vague. The kind of uneasy feeling you convince yourself is paranoia. But after hearing how defensive the parents became, I started wondering if this wasn't the first time they'd needed to excuse strange behavior from him. A few days passed after that. Nothing happened. And honestly, part of me started relaxing again. Life settled back into normal routines. Classes, work, evenings at home. I even remember feeling embarrassed for how nervous I'd been walking near the trail afterward. It's strange how quickly people try to return to normal after something unsettling. Your brain wants stability so badly that it starts rewriting events into something manageable. Then the attack happened. It was late, around 2 in the morning. Our house was always extremely quiet at night because of where we lived. No traffic sounds, no nearby neighbors. Usually the loudest thing you'd hear was wind moving through trees outside or pipes creaking occasionally in winter. I woke up suddenly because I heard a noise somewhere in the house. At first I thought one of the cats had knocked something over in the kitchen. That happened all the time. I remember lying there half asleep trying to decide whether it was worth getting up to check. Then I heard movement in the hallway. Not normal movement either. Fast, deliberate. Before I could fully sit up, my bedroom door opened. And for a second, my brain genuinely couldn't process what I was seeing. There was just this dark figure standing in the doorway. Then my eyes adjusted enough to recognize him. The neighbor's son. And he was holding a kitchen knife. Even now, years later, that moment still feels disconnected from reality in my memory. It's like my brain rejected what it was seeing for a split second because the image made no sense. He rushed toward the bed almost immediately. No hesitation, no speaking, just movement. I remember him swinging the knife downward while I rolled sideways off the mattress instinctively. Everything after that became noise and confusion. I was screaming for my parents without even realizing I was doing it. The room exploded into chaos almost instantly. My mom yelled from down the hallway. My dad was already running toward my room. I remember hearing his footsteps before I actually saw him. Then suddenly my dad slammed into him near the side of the bed. The sound of them hitting the floor is something I still remember clearly. Furniture crashing, my mom screaming, the knife clattering briefly before being grabbed again. During the struggle, the blade caught my arm and shoulder. Together. Police lights outside the house. Paramedics asking questions I barely understood. My mom crying in the background while trying to stay calm for me. I ended up spending several days in the hospital because of the injuries. Thankfully, none of them were life-threatening, but they were serious enough that doctors wanted to monitor me closely. What stayed with me most afterward wasn't even the physical pain. It was the realization that he had entered our house intentionally, quietly, at 2 in the morning, not impulsively, planned. That thought haunted me for a long time because it completely changed how I interpreted all the earlier interactions. The staring, the hand-grabbing, standing near the trail. None of it felt accidental anymore. It felt like fixation. The police arrested him not long after the attack. Apparently he hadn't made much effort to hide afterward, which honestly made the entire thing even harder for me to understand. It was like some part of him never believed consequences applied to him normally. What followed stretched across years. Court hearings, restraining orders, legal processes that dragged on endlessly in the exhausting way those situations always seem to. He spent time in prison, got released, ended up back in trouble again later. Small towns circulate information strangely, so even after I moved away, I'd occasionally hear updates through relatives or old neighbors. Every time his name came up, I'd feel that same knot in my stomach all over again. Then, around 5 or 6 years ago, I heard something that unsettled me in an entirely different way. He had been found dead inside that same house. By then, both of his parents had passed away years apart, and the property had slowly deteriorated into one of those abandoned places people drive past without looking directly at. Apparently, he'd somehow ended up back there alone, living inside the decaying house. Nobody seems completely sure what happened. From what I heard, someone nearby eventually noticed a strange smell and contacted authorities. That was how they found him. Now the windows are boarded up with plywood, and the yard is almost completely consumed by weeds and overgrown brush. The entire property looks like the woods are slowly reclaiming it, piece by piece. Whenever I visit my parents now and drive down that road, I still see the house sitting back there between the trees. Most people passing by probably don't think anything about it. Just another abandoned rural property collapsing quietly with time. But every single time I see it, I think about that night. About waking up to a figure standing in my doorway. About how close things came to ending differently. And honestly, what still unsettles me most isn't even the violence itself. It's the realization that for a long time before that night, my instincts had already been warning me something was wrong. I just kept trying to convince myself I was imagining it.